It was an ordinary morning at a small private airfield where a helicopter was preparing for takeoff. The helicopter, owned by a well-known millionaire CEO, was scheduled to leave for a business trip. The CEO, known for her successful company and busy lifestyle, was no stranger to flying herself, as she had a pilot's license and had been flying for years. However, this particular flight was about to take a very unexpected turn. As the helicopter revved its engines, ready to lift off the ground, a police patrol nearby noticed the unusual sight. Normally, helicopters of this size and importance had to go through proper flight checks and permissions. But when they looked closer, they saw the pilot behind the controls was none other than the CEO herself. This was the first sign that something wasn't quite right. Helicopters, especially one as expensive as this, were usually flown by professionals hired for such tasks. Seeing the CEO at the controls raised questions. Was she allowed to fly the helicopter today? Had all the proper protocols been followed? The officers on duty, who were only doing their usual patrols, couldn't ignore the situation. They immediately radioed in to their superiors to ask if there had been proper flight clearance for the helicopter. The response they received was clear. No clearance had been granted. With that information, the officers decided to take action. They had no idea who the pilot was at the time, but the priority was safety, and they were going to stop the helicopter from taking off until everything was in order. As the officers approached the helicopter, they were surprised to see the CEO still in the cockpit, calm and ready to depart. The police had a clear task now. They had to ensure that she was not flying without the proper clearance. The officers immediately began asking questions, asking for her credentials and the necessary paperwork. The CEO, though startled by the interruption, was calm. She explained that she was indeed the pilot and that she had all the necessary qualifications and permits to fly. She had been flying for many years and had always ensured that her flights were up to standard. But the officers weren't convinced. They needed more than just her word. Despite her calm response, they couldn't let the helicopter take off without confirming that all of the flight protocols had been followed. The officers demanded that she step out of the cockpit, which surprised the CEO even more. She explained that she had done everything by the book. Her certifications, flight plans, and all the required checks had been completed before departure. She was ready to go, and this delay was taking time away from her busy schedule. The officers, however, remained firm. Safety was their priority, and they couldn't allow the helicopter to take off unless they were sure that everything was in order. This situation wasn't about who she was. It was about ensuring that all flights followed the law and safety guidelines. They explained that they needed to verify her qualifications before letting her fly. The CEO's frustration grew. She had a business to run and meetings to attend, and the time lost on this delay was significant. But as much as she wanted to get moving, she also understood that safety had to come first. She agreed to provide the necessary documentation, but the situation was now tense. What started as a simple routine flight was quickly turning into a standoff between the Millionaire CEO and the police. The clock was ticking, and both sides were determined to stand their ground. Little did they know, this was just the beginning of a much bigger, unexpected twist. The helicopter sat still on the tarmac, its engines humming softly, waiting for permission to take off. The CEO, though calm, was growing impatient. Her tight schedule had already been thrown off course, and she knew that every minute of delay meant lost time. She had a business to run, and an important meeting she couldn't afford to miss. She had prepared for this flight carefully, with every detail checked, and yet now she was stuck on the ground, waiting for approval that seemed to be taking forever. The police officers stood firm in front of the helicopter, looking up at the CEO with serious expressions. They weren't backing down. The situation had already grown tense, and both sides were determined to prove they were right. The officers insisted they needed to verify the CEO's flight clearance, while the CEO felt more and more frustrated by the delay. One of the officers, Officer Miller, approached the cockpit and looked up at the CEO. "Ma'am, we need to see your credentials before you can take off. We were informed that your flight didn't have clearance, and we have to make sure everything is in order before allowing you to leave." The CEO looked down at him, her expression calm but with a hint of irritation. She had heard this all before. "I've been flying for years. My qualifications are all in order," she said, her voice steady. "I'm licensed to fly this helicopter. I've done everything according to the rules, and I'm ready to go." Despite her calm response, Officer Miller wasn't convinced. "We just need to double-check everything. It's part of the protocol, ma'am. We can't allow you to take off until we're sure everything is clear." The CEO sighed, clearly frustrated, but nodded in agreement. She understood the importance of safety and regulation, but she also knew this was starting to feel like a waste of time. She had flown countless times without incident, and now it seemed like an unnecessary delay was threatening to derail her plans. As Officer Miller continued to speak with the CEO, other officers began to examine the helicopter and gather information. They requested to see her flight plan, her certifications, and any paperwork that could prove her flight had been authorized. It was standard procedure, but the CEO couldn't help but feel that the entire situation was being blown out of proportion. She was a successful CEO, used to dealing with important matters and managing tight schedules. She had flown her helicopter before without incident. She had checked and rechecked her papers before arriving at the airfield, and she knew she had done everything by the book. Yet here she was, standing in the way of a crucial business meeting, all because the police officers were determined to follow the rules. Officer Miller, meanwhile, was doing his job, determined to follow protocol. "We just need to make sure everything is cleared before you go. It's for everyone's safety," he repeated, trying to sound reassuring. The CEO could feel her patience thinning. She had never been in a situation like this before. She had dealt with all kinds of business challenges, but this was different. She couldn't help but wonder why the officers were so focused on her flight. She had never experienced such an issue before, and it felt like they were doubting her qualifications. Still, the officers were unmoved, and the CEO was left with little choice but to comply. "Fine," she said, "I'll provide you with all the documents, but I need to get going soon." As she handed over the paperwork, the officers carefully examined each document. It felt like an eternity as the clock ticked away. The CEO couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, but she also knew that there was little she could do. The officers were doing their job, and she had to wait. What neither the CEO nor the officers knew was that this simple delay would soon reveal a shocking truth, one that neither side had expected. The air around the helicopter seemed thick with tension. The police officers continued to scrutinize the CEO's paperwork, flipping through the flight plans and certifications she had handed over. The CEO, standing outside the cockpit, was doing her best to remain calm, but every passing minute felt like a lost opportunity. She glanced at her watch for the 5th time in as many minutes, trying to keep her frustration in check. She had come to this airfield with a clear plan: take off, get to her meeting, and handle the business that would help her company grow. It wasn't just a regular meeting, it was crucial. She had worked for months to secure this deal, and now it seemed like a small mistake was standing in the way of everything. She couldn't afford this kind of delay. Every minute lost now was a minute of wasted potential. As the officers continued to examine her credentials, the CEO stood with her arms crossed, trying to stay composed. She had done everything by the book. Her certifications were up to date, her flight plan was clear, and the helicopter was in perfect condition. Everything should have been fine, but the officers seemed to be missing something. Why wasn't this being handled faster? Officer Miller, still focused on the documents in front of him, didn't seem to notice the mounting tension. He asked the CEO questions about her flight history and whether she had previously flown in the area. Each time she answered, his face remained serious, not giving away any sign of whether he was satisfied with her responses. Meanwhile, the other officers walked around the helicopter, checking the fuel levels, inspecting the rotor blades, and even checking the registration numbers once again. It seemed like they were looking for something that wasn't there. The CEO felt her patience beginning to thin. "Why is this taking so long?" she finally asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "I've been flying this helicopter for years without incident. I have all the right qualifications. What more do you want?" Officer Miller turned toward her, his face impassive. "Ma'am, we just need to be sure. It's part of the procedure. We can't take any chances when it comes to safety." The CEO knew he was right in some ways, but it didn't make it any easier. She understood the importance of safety and regulations, but this felt like overkill. The officers were making her feel as though she was being treated like an amateur, and it stung. This was her helicopter, and she was perfectly capable of flying it. She had proven herself time and time again. Still, the delay continued. The minutes seemed to stretch on forever, and the meeting she had been so eager to attend was slipping further away. She could feel the pressure mounting, not just from the time ticking away, but from the feeling that her professionalism was being questioned. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Officer Miller looked up from the paperwork. He spoke into his radio, requesting confirmation on the flight clearance. His voice was calm, but the CEO could hear the uncertainty in his tone. The radio crackled, and a voice on the other end responded. Officer Miller's eyes narrowed as he listened, taking in the information. The CEO tried to remain calm, but she could sense that something wasn't right. The officers seemed to be getting more serious by the second. After a few more moments of silence, Officer Miller turned toward the CEO. "Ma'am, there's been a mix-up. We've just received new information." The CEO's heart skipped a beat. A mix-up. Was this all just a misunderstanding? She hadn't expected this kind of twist. What could possibly explain the delay that had already cost her so much precious time? She waited, unsure of what the officers were about to reveal. The answer, when it came, would be a shock to everyone. The tension was thick in the air as the officers gathered around the helicopter, exchanging whispered words among themselves. The CEO stood to the side, arms crossed, waiting impatiently for an explanation. She had already given them all the necessary documentation, but the delay was stretching into a second hour, and she could feel the stress mounting. Her meeting was now well behind schedule, and the minutes lost were turning into hours. Officer Miller was still on the radio, speaking with the control tower. His brow furrowed as he listened, and the CEO could see that something wasn't right. She tried to stay calm, but her thoughts were racing. Was this just a simple misunderstanding? Or was there something deeper at play here? Her patience was wearing thin, but she also knew that she needed to stay professional and handle the situation with grace. As Officer Miller continued to speak into the radio, another officer, Officer Hayes, walked over to the CEO. He had a serious expression on his face. "We've run into a bit of a problem," he said, his voice low but urgent. "The information we got earlier wasn't clear. The clearance for your flight. It wasn't fully confirmed." The CEO's heart sank. "What do you mean?" "I followed every rule. My flight plan was approved, and I have all the necessary paperwork." Officer Hayes nodded. "We understand that, ma'am." But the issue was with the clearance confirmation from the tower. There seems to have been a miscommunication. The CEO tried to process the information, but it didn't make sense. How could there have been a miscommunication? She had checked everything before arriving at the airfield. Her flight plan was confirmed. Her credentials were in order. What else could there possibly be? As the officers continued to speak to the control tower, the CEO's frustration grew. She could hear the officers talking about more details, asking questions, and checking paperwork again. Every few moments, they would glance at her, and she could see the confusion on their faces. It was clear that they weren't getting the answers they expected, and neither was she. Then the breakthrough came. Officer Miller, who had been on the radio for some time, finally put the receiver down and turned toward the CEO. His expression was different now, less tense, almost apologetic. "I'm sorry for the confusion, Mom," he said, his voice more relaxed. "It seems there was an error in the system. The clearance for your flight was mistakenly flagged." The CEO blinked in disbelief. What? A system error? Yes, Officer Miller confirmed. Your flight was actually cleared for takeoff, but somehow, the system flagged it as an unauthorized flight. It wasn't anything to do with you personally, just a technical issue. The CEO felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was mixed with frustration. All this time spent waiting, all the confusion, and for what? A system error. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She had been caught in the middle of something completely out of her control. Her heart was still racing, but she was glad to finally hear the truth. So, I've been stuck here for no reason? She asked, her voice calm but sharp with frustration. Officer Miller nodded. It appears so. We're terribly sorry for the confusion. You've been fully cleared, and there's no reason why you can't take off now. The CEO gave a tight smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Thank you for clearing that up. But next time, I'd appreciate it if you checked your systems before stopping someone. The officers, though embarrassed by the mistake, quickly apologized once again. The CEO, now relieved but still frustrated, finally stepped back into the cockpit. The delay had cost her precious time, but at least she could finally get going. As the helicopter lifted off the ground, she couldn't help but shake her head at the entire ordeal. She had done everything right. And yet here she was, flying through the sky later than she had planned. The incident would be something she'd never forget, but at least it was over. Little did she know, the surprising twists were far from over. As the helicopter finally lifted off the ground, the CEO felt a mix of relief and frustration. The air around her was clear, and the flight ahead should have been smooth. But as she rose higher, her thoughts continued to swirl, still bothered by the events that had just unfolded. She had been cleared to fly after a long and stressful delay. But the truth behind the confusion was still nagging at her. How had a simple flight clearance turned into such a mess? The more she thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't just a random mistake. It didn't make sense for her flight plan to have been mistakenly flagged, especially given how careful she was with all the details. The officers had seemed surprised by the error, but they didn't have any answers for her. They had apologized and explained that it was a system malfunction, but there had to be more to it. As the helicopter flew over the city, heading toward her destination, the CEO made a decision. She couldn't let this go. She needed to find out exactly what had caused the delay and why it had been handled the way it had. Something about the whole situation felt off, and she wasn't the kind of person to let things slide when it didn't sit right with her. Back at the airfield, the police officers had already begun to work on the issue behind the scenes. Officer Miller, who had been in charge of the situation, was still trying to piece together what had happened. He had spoken to the air traffic control tower again and was trying to understand why the system had flagged the CEO's flight. He knew it wasn't something that should have happened, and he wanted to make sure that it didn't cause any more problems for anyone else in the future. The investigation into the error revealed a surprising detail. The mistake wasn't entirely due to the system itself, as the officers had initially believed. It turned out that the flight clearance had been flagged due to a clerical mix-up in the air traffic control database. A new system had been recently implemented, and the transition wasn't as smooth as expected. As a result, certain flights, like the CEO's, had been incorrectly marked as unauthorized, even though everything had been approved on the ground. It was a technical problem, yes, but one that could have been avoided if the officers had double-checked the flight clearance before taking action. The officers realized that the mistake had been a result of both human error and a temporary glitch in the new system. As soon as Officer Miller had all the details, he knew he had to explain the situation fully to the CEO. He made arrangements to meet with her when she returned from her business trip to make things right. When the CEO landed at her destination, her phone buzzed with a message from Officer Miller. The message explained the situation in full, how the error had occurred, why her flight had been flagged, and the technical details behind it all. It was a relief to hear the truth, but it didn't change the fact that she had been unnecessarily delayed for hours. She couldn't help but feel disappointed in the way things had been handled. The mistake wasn't her fault, but it had affected her in ways she couldn't ignore. Still, she appreciated the honesty and the effort to correct the issue. It was a small comfort, but it didn't take away the stress of the morning. In the end, the CEO decided that it was a lesson learned. She would make sure to follow up on the issue and ensure that the airfield and police officers were better prepared next time. As a businesswoman, she knew that mistakes happened, but the key was to learn from them and make sure they didn't happen again. Despite the frustration of the situation, she couldn't help but smile. She had handled the stress and the confusion with calmness, and in the end, it didn't stop her from achieving her goals. She would continue to move forward, but this experience was one she wouldn't forget anytime soon. After the stressful morning, the CEO finally found herself in the air, heading to her important meeting. But her mind couldn't stop racing. The whole situation at the airfield was beginning to feel like more than just a simple misunderstanding. There had to be something deeper behind the delay, something that wasn't explained in the officer's radio conversation. The more she thought about it, the more she felt that this entire ordeal couldn't have been just about a technical glitch or a paperwork mix-up. As the helicopter cruised steadily through the sky, the CEO couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she was missing. The mistake, though acknowledged and explained by Officer Miller, seemed too big to be explained away by a simple error in the system. The clearance for her flight had been flagged, but why hadn't anyone double-checked it before stopping her? She knew the authorities took flight safety seriously, but everything had felt rushed and hasty. Even when they had initially approached her, it didn't make sense. Her curiosity took over. She decided she needed to get to the bottom of it, even if it meant making more calls or digging deeper into the issue after her meeting. She would figure out why the flight had been flagged in the first place. As soon as her business trip was over, she was determined to revisit the situation and get a full explanation from the authorities. Back at the airfield, the officers were working hard to understand what went wrong. Officer Miller, who had led the investigation, had already started looking into the technical glitch more thoroughly. He wasn't convinced by the simple explanation they had given the CEO. He knew that the new air traffic system was still in its early stages, but the issue didn't feel like a mere system malfunction. There was more to it, and he was determined to find out what had caused the error. As Officer Miller dug deeper, he discovered something unexpected. The glitch in the system wasn't entirely a result of the new software. It seemed that the database had been tampered with, though no one could immediately explain how. Flight information from certain private aircraft, including the CEO's, had been altered, causing their clearances to be flagged automatically. This wasn't a technical glitch. This looked like intentional interference. The officers were now in a difficult position. They couldn't explain how or why the flight information had been tampered with, but they knew it wasn't just a mistake. Someone had manipulated the system, and the police were left to figure out who and why. Officer Miller called in higher authorities to help investigate further. After a few hours of looking into the matter, it became clear that the manipulation was no accident. It was revealed that the tampering of flight data was part of a larger issue involving a group of people trying to slow down certain flights for reasons that were still unclear. While they didn't yet know the full extent of the plot, they knew that the CEO's flight was just one of several that had been delayed because of this tampering. For the CEO, hearing about this new development was both shocking and unsettling. She had been just one person caught in the middle of something much bigger. Her delayed flight was no longer just a minor inconvenience. It was part of a larger plan, one that she hadn't even known about until now. The news left her with more questions than answers. Who was behind this, and what did they hope to achieve by delaying private flights? What was the purpose of this sabotage? While the situation wasn't yet fully understood, the officers knew they had to act fast to stop further disruptions. They had to find out who was manipulating the system and why, but it was clear that this was no ordinary mistake. The CEO, too, was now involved in something far more complex than she ever imagined. As her helicopter soared toward its destination, She knew that the road ahead wasn't going to be as simple as it seemed. The story was far from over. The CEO had finally arrived at her meeting, but the events of the day had left a lasting impact on her. The frustration of the delay, the confusion at the airfield, and the shocking discovery of system tampering kept replaying in her mind. She had come to the airfield expecting a routine flight, only to find herself caught in a web of misunderstandings and potential sabotage. Now that her meeting was over, she found herself faced with a bigger question. How should she respond to what had happened? As she sat in her office later that day, she reviewed her notes from the meeting. The business deal had gone well, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the events at the airfield. She knew she had to take action. It wasn't just about her own personal inconvenience anymore. The integrity of the air traffic control system and the safety of all those who flew private aircraft were at risk. She couldn't let this go, not when it appeared that someone had intentionally caused the delays for unknown reasons. The CEO was not one to back down from a challenge. She had built her business from the ground up, navigating obstacles and overcoming setbacks along the way. This situation, while unexpected, was no different. She was determined to get to the bottom of what had happened and hold those responsible accountable. The first thing she did was contact Officer Miller. She needed more answers. If the tampering with flight data was as serious as it seemed, she wanted to be sure that the authorities were taking the matter seriously. She also wanted to know how they planned to prevent it from happening again. Officer Miller was quick to respond, agreeing to meet with her at her convenience. He explained that the investigation into the tampered system was still ongoing, but that they had already begun identifying potential suspects. The authorities were focusing on a group of individuals who seemed to have access to the air traffic control system, and they were narrowing down the list. He assured her that the police were working tirelessly to find out who was behind the sabotage, and that they were taking the matter seriously. As the investigation continued, the CEO began to understand just how complex the situation had become. The more she learned about the tampering, the more she realized that this wasn't just a simple case of a system error. The perpetrators had carefully orchestrated the delays, targeting private flights like hers for reasons that were still unclear. The idea that someone could manipulate such an important system with such precision disturbed her. It wasn't just about causing inconvenience. It was about compromising the safety and security of countless people. The CEO knew that once the culprits were caught, there would be a lot of questions to answer. But for now, she had to stay focused on the next steps. She considered speaking publicly about the incident, but she wasn't sure yet if it was the right move. She didn't want to escalate things prematurely, especially if the investigation was still in its early stages. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that shining a light on what had happened could help protect others who might fall victim to similar delays in the future. She decided that, once the investigation was completed, she would make her experience public. She would speak out about the dangers of tampering with flight data and emphasize the importance of maintaining secure systems for everyone. If her story could help prevent this from happening again, it would be worth it. She would stand up not only for herself, but for others who depended on air travel for business and personal reasons. As she prepared for the next day, the CEO felt a sense of determination. She had faced countless challenges throughout her career, and she knew that this was just another obstacle to overcome. But this time, the stakes were higher. This time, it wasn't just about a missed meeting. It was about the safety and trust of the entire aviation system. She was ready to take on whatever came next. As the news of the system tampering began to spread, the public reacted quickly. What had started as a seemingly small incident at a private airfield was now a topic of discussion in homes, offices, and online forums everywhere. The story of the CEO's delayed flight, caused by a mysterious flight clearance issue, had caught the attention of the media, and soon the public was buzzing with questions. Was it just a simple mistake, or was there something more sinister at play? News outlets ran stories about the event, with some focusing on the CEO's frustration and others highlighting the police's handling of the situation. Many people sympathized with the CEO. They understood how important her time was and how a simple delay could have serious consequences, especially for someone at the top of a major company. Others focused on the unusual circumstances surrounding the incident, how a technical issue had led to such an extensive delay, and how the authorities seemed to have missed a key detail in the system. But the biggest shock came when it was revealed that the flight data had been deliberately tampered with. Public opinion quickly shifted. People were outraged by the idea that someone could intentionally cause disruptions like this, especially when it involved something as important as flight safety. The idea of a group of individuals manipulating air traffic control data seemed too unbelievable to many, but it was clear that the situation was far more complex than anyone had initially imagined. The CEO, meanwhile, was not one to sit idly by while the story played out in the media. She was determined to ensure that the full truth came out. She spoke to the press about her experience, emphasizing that it was not just a matter of inconvenience. It was about the safety and security of everyone who relied on the aviation system. She called for stronger measures to protect private flights from such tampering and urged the authorities to do everything in their power to catch those responsible. The CEO's public response made waves. She didn't just speak out for herself. She spoke for others who might be at risk of experiencing similar issues. Her story became an example of how even the most careful individuals could be caught up in a system that was vulnerable to manipulation. It was a call to action for both the public and the authorities to take a closer look at the security of flight systems and to ensure that this kind of incident would never happen again. As the investigation continued, the public's curiosity only grew. Many people wanted to know who was behind the tampering. Was it a rogue group trying to disrupt the system? Or was it something more organized? The authorities were working hard to track down the culprits, but the process was slow. The more they uncovered, the more questions they had. It seemed that this was no random act. It was part of a larger, more complex plan. In the meantime, the CEO's business had remained unaffected. She had been able to make up for lost time and carry on with her work, but she knew that the story was far from over. While her business life had returned to normal, she knew that there was still much more to be done to ensure that the tampering was fully addressed. The public support for the CEO was overwhelming, and many people stood behind her call for better security in the aviation industry. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that this incident had far-reaching implications. What had started as a personal inconvenience for the CEO had turned into a larger issue that affected everyone who flew. The CEO's courage in speaking out had made a difference, and the public was eager to see how the authorities would handle the situation going forward. After weeks of uncertainty and rising tension, the truth behind the mysterious delays to the CEO's flight was finally revealed. The public had been eagerly awaiting answers, with questions swirling around the system error that had caused her helicopter to be grounded. What had started as an ordinary travel day had turned into a headline-making story, leaving everyone on edge. But now, the authorities were ready to make a full announcement. The CEO, who had been following the investigation closely, was eager to learn what had really happened. She had worked tirelessly to stay ahead of her business commitments, despite the distractions caused by the delay. Yet, in the back of her mind, she knew that the question remained: who was behind the tampering of her flight's clearance? Why had someone targeted her? And how had they gained access to such sensitive information? As the authorities prepared to announce their findings, the CEO was contacted by Officer Miller, who had been leading the investigation. "We have the answers you've been waiting for," he said when he called her. "We've uncovered the full extent of what happened, and we need to meet." The CEO arranged to meet with him the following day. She knew that the answers could help not only her but others in the aviation industry who relied on a secure system for private flights. She arrived at the meeting, eager to hear what had happened behind the scenes. Officer Miller explained that after a thorough investigation, the authorities had uncovered the reason for the mishap. It wasn't just a simple mistake in the system, as initially thought. Instead, it was revealed that a group of individuals, working from within the system, had intentionally manipulated flight data to delay certain private flights. The CEO's flight was just one of several that had been impacted. The people responsible had managed to access the air traffic control database and alter the clearance information for specific flights. The group was acting with a hidden agenda, although the full reason behind the interference was still unclear. The authorities had managed to identify some of the individuals involved, but the investigation was still ongoing. For the CEO, hearing this news was both a relief and a shock. While she was glad to know the truth, she couldn't help but feel uneasy knowing that the tampering had been intentional. The idea that someone had been able to interfere with a system so vital to aviation safety was unsettling. She knew that, while the authorities were working to resolve the situation, it was far from over. The CEO's experience had brought to light a major vulnerability in the aviation system that needed immediate attention. She felt a strong sense of responsibility to ensure that this didn't happen to anyone else. The tampering had affected her business, but more importantly, it had affected the trust that people placed in the safety of their flights. Following the meeting with Officer Miller, the CEO decided to speak out publicly about the incident. She wanted to ensure that the public knew the truth and that something would be done to prevent this from happening again. Her story quickly spread across the media, and her call for stronger security measures in air traffic control systems gained widespread support. People from all walks of life rallied behind her message, emphasizing the need for better protection against such breaches. As the investigation continued, more details emerged, and the authorities began to close in on the group responsible for the tampering. While the full story of the perpetrators was still unfolding, one thing was clear. The CEO's courage in speaking out had made a significant impact. She had turned a frustrating experience into an opportunity for change. Though the situation had caused her grief frustration, the CEO emerged stronger from it. She had learned that sometimes the unexpected challenges are the ones that lead to real progress. The tampering of her flight had set off a chain reaction that would ultimately improve aviation security for everyone. And for the CEO, it was a reminder that no matter the obstacles, she would always fight for what was right.